Hi, good evening, everybody. It's Rabbi Kolakowski. I just wanted to talk about the video that came out this morning on Prager U, where they said if you hate Israel, you're no friend of Jews, and talking about tokenism and things like that. But the number one issue that I wanted to discuss here, and I know I've discussed it time before, but perhaps someone will be interested in hearing what I have to say. Now, I want to make it clear, first of all, I love Prager U, and I listen to Dennis Prager, although I kind of like Rush Limbaugh better. They're on at the same time, but I've been kind of hooked on Dennis Prager. He let me come on the show twice on the call-ins, which was nice, and he's a mensch. But I've for a long time disagreed with Dennis Prager, and my opinions of him has not really changed, meaning I find him to be amiable and likable, but I disagree with a lot of his views on Judaism, particularly, even if they're mainstream views. Judaism was never about numbers. We've always been a minority religion. And the Bible says it's not because of your great numbers, but rather because Abraham was chosen. Abraham was one person, standing up against the whole world that were worshiping idols. So, put these things in perspective. I'm a Republican. I vote Republican. I voted for the president. Plan to vote for the president again. I'm religiously conservative, somewhat. Some people might call me a religious fundamentalist, although I find fundamentalism to be anathema. And I think that everybody has something they're fundamentalist about. When a lot of the people who speak out against fundamentalism are themselves fundamentalists. And I think with this particular area, I find there are two issues I want to argue respectfully against this video from Prager U. I'm not one of these, left-wing people who think Prager U is horrible and should be banned and this and that. No, I'm very supportive of Prager U. I love Prager U. I wish I could get a master's degree from Prager U. Maybe a PhD also. But part of learning is learning that we disagree, and that's how we find these things. So anyway, 2 points that Mr. Prager brings out in this video about Israel and anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism that I want to argue against, even though there are many points I want to argue against, two in particular. The number one issue that I want to bring up here, and he even mentioned on his show today, and I wished I had time to call up and discuss this issue. And I think if I would explain it to him like this, him being a Jew who was raised Orthodox but has tremendous respect for Christianity and was raised with respect for Christianity, I picture him as the type of Orthodox Jew who would watch Fulton Sheen every week, that type of thing. And just explain what are we talking about here. So he said that Jews are more than just a religion. There's a peoplehood that goes beyond a religious definition, which he himself was kind of lamenting today. He said, he's envious that the Christians are able to say someone who doesn't believe in Jesus is not a Christian, but can we say that someone who abandons certain basic Jewish ideas is not a Jew? The way I formulate it is as follows, and the way I would explain it in comparison to Christianity, particularly in Catholicism, as it was in centuries ago, and still technically is, even though it's not being enforced as it used to be. But we most Jewish people who are ignorant of history and so forth, they're going to assume that the Spanish Inquisition was the church fighting against the Jews, right? We know that the fact is it's not what it was about at all. The Spanish expulsion of Jews from Spain, that was Spain's fight against the Jews. And those Jews that remained were forced to convert to Christianity, to Catholicism. At the time was the only church in Spain available. There had already been the schism in the church between East and West, but if you're in Spain, you're going to be a Catholic, and that was the only choice you had, or you leave, right? So many Jewish people at least ostensibly convert to Christianity. And then the Inquisition came out against those who weren't really being true to their Christianity. Meaning they professed Christianity, but they weren't living as Christians. And so therefore the Inquisition was there to punish them for breaking their oaths. And that's pretty much it. That's the story. I don't know what else you want me to say about this. So meaning in the same way, meaning we have someone who is considered by the church to be a Christian, even if perhaps they don't consider themselves to be a Christian. We're not only talking about the Spanish Inquisition, but there were it wasn't only Jews who converted to Christianity, all kinds of Christians who weren't living up to the standards of the Inquisition were subject to the Inquisition, right? And so in the eyes of the church, they were Christians, even if in their own eyes they're not Christians. So I would say in the same way, an atheist, in his own eyes, he has no religion, he doesn't practice Judaism. What right does he have to self-identify as a Jew? He has none. But in the eyes of the synagogue, he is a Jew. Meaning he's subject to the Inquisition of the synagogue, quote unquote, to use a comparison. And that's really what it means. It doesn't mean that you can go and say you somehow represent the Jewish community, even if it's the majority of the Jewish community that's subject to this Inquisition, meaning that by rabbinical standards they are Jews, but by their own esteem they're not. And the thing is, the fact is, most people who are active, let's say in the Jewish Federation, are going to a conservative or Reform temple on a pretty regular basis. So those are religious Jews. We might disagree on one hand with their mode of their religion, and on the other hand with perhaps liberal politics and even left-wing politics. But at least their expression, and we might even also say that according to Orthodox and conservative standards, some of the people who are part of the Reform congregations might not be considered Jewish by the standards of the Orthodox and the conservative. But this definition of who is a Jew, what is a Jew, is a strictly religious one, and so it's inaccurate what Dennis Prager is saying to say that a Christian who stops believing in Jesus is no longer a Christian, but a Jew who stops believing in God or in the Torah is still a Jew. They are a Jew by the definition of Judaism, and so too a Christian who was baptized into the church and then apostatizes, in the eyes of the church, is seen as an apostate Christian. He's seen as someone who has broken the covenant, and so too the apostate Jew is seen as someone who has broken the covenant. That doesn't mean we treat people disrespectfully, and even to the point where, if an apostate Jewish man wants to marry an apostate Jewish woman, they ask me to be Messiah Kedushin, I'll come be Messiah Kedushin. But none of them can be Eid Kedushin. We need to get an Ehr L'Chayid to be an Eid Kedushin. Question of counting a minyan and this and that, these type of questions. These are there's different interpretations of at what point someone doesn't count for a minyan. But there is a certain point. That's the thing. There is a certain point where someone who's a Jewish man with a Jewish mother is no longer part of the Jewish community. He doesn't count for a minyan. He doesn't. His wine is not kosher. Was a man or a woman. There is a certain point where I would generally say in Jewish law there's three categories. There's the Jew and the Gentile, and there's the non-Gentile or the Jewish apostate, meaning the vast majority of Jews, perhaps you could say, are in that third category. They're not part of the Klal Yisrael. They are people who are subject to the Inquisition in the eyes of the rabbinate of Judaism, in the eyes of Judaism. Meaning a Gentile is under no obligation to keep the 613 commandments, but the apostate Jew is under obligation to repent. The non-Jew is welcome to convert, but he's under no obligation to do so. And I believe we should make the non-Jews more easy to convert. If they're serious about it, they're usually better Jews than the born Jews. But a lot of these born Jews, they have a chip on their shoulder, and they think, So this is part A. Part B is the other thing that he says is that there are three pillars of Judaism: are God, Torah, and Israel. Which I don't know where he got this idea from. I can't quote a source. So that's the first thing. This idea of Jewish. And so then what about why, when in the Bible the Jews, the Klal Yisrael, they're called a people, they're called a Am, they're called a Goy Kadosh, they're called this, that. We have to put that in the perspective of the language. Just because something is translated from Hebrew into English in a particular way doesn't mean that the English language is the perfect way to translate this. I mean, in Islam, what do they call their community at large? The Ummah. The Ummah doesn't mean the Arab Ummah. They don't include Christian Arabs in the Ummah. In the Ummah are Muslims of whatever race they come from, are the Muslims, right? And that's the history. That's the reality. And so, if we take more of these are both coming from these Semitic Middle Eastern traditions and cultures. This idea of Am Yisrael is not comparable to the French people or the Italian people or the German people, but more comparable to the Ummah of the Muslims. And the Muslims got the idea from us, not the other way around. So the Western definition of a nation is not necessarily the Eastern definition of a nation. But the atheist is not part of the Am Yisrael. He's not part of the Klal Yisrael. Even, Ad Kedei Kach, I'll tell you, a very prominent Rosh Hashiva was sitting with a very prominent Hasidic Rebbe, trying to convince him to join a particular event that he said was an event that belonged to the whole Klal Yisrael. Now the Reform and the Conservative were not there, and even many of the modern Orthodox, some weren't, whatever. Maybe the modern Orthodox Machmir, maybe some of them were there, some weren't. I don't know. But this Rosh Hashiva was trying to convince this Rebbe. He said, "This is for the whole Klal Yisrael. You have to come, Rebbe." And the Rebbe's brother was there with his Hasidim, but this Rebbe with his Hasidim, he told his Hasidim this wasn't for us. We don't need to go to this. And the Rebbe asked, "Is a particular Hasidic community? Are they going to be participating in this?" And this Rosh Hashiva, and you'll see why I'm not mentioning names, but other people know the story. Rosh Hashiva said, "This Hasidic community is not part of Klal Yisrael. One of the biggest Hasidic communities there are, one of the most famous that there are." But Rosh Hashiva said, this very prominent Rosh Hashiva said, this particular Hasidic community, they're not part of the Klal Yisrael. We're talking about pious Hasidic Jews that we disagree with on certain issues. They're not part of the Klal Yisrael. Now, this Rebbe didn't believe that, even though he disagrees with them too. But that this Rosh Hashiva can use this language to say this particular Hasidic group is not part of Klal Yisrael shows that it's not the way that it's not viewed classically in the way that we think of it, that it includes everybody. It's not to say, I still believe in having a certain level of brotherhood, but I'm friendly to Reform and Conservative clergy the same way I'm friendly to Christian and Muslim clergy. I believe in being a mensch. Same way, I might not believe that certain people who are biologically male and identify as female, or biologically female and identify as male, I might not believe that they're male or female, but I'll be respectful to them and use the pronouns that they prefer. I'm not going to make this whole big deal, preferred pronouns, this and that, but at least I'm going to recognize that I'm going to be polite even to the point where I disagree. Just being a mensch, just being polite, having manners, and not being rude. So that's the issue of the peoplehood issue, meaning peoplehood is not a free-for-all. I think most Jews will say, meaning the Reform and the Conservative are going to agree, that the Jews for Jesus are not the part of Klal Yisrael, even if we're talking about people who are born Jewish. But the thing is the fact is that it's the Reform and the Conservative that made the Jews for Jesus possible. Because by accepting an atheist Jew, how can we deny the Jew for Jesus who has much more in common with us than the atheist has? And people are going to say, well, they're missionaries, they're selling false goods, they're false advertising, things like that. All right, well, that's true, but the same is true with the humanist Jews. There's no reason. There's no, the example that Rabbi, what's his name, Lapin, he wrote an article about this. He said, I don't understand, you're not letting the Jews for Jesus march in the Salute to Israel parade, but you let the gay synagogue march in the Salute to Israel parade, right? And they said, well, the Jews for Jesus, they're violating from the Ten Commandments, you should have no other gods before me. Whereas the gay synagogue, that's just something in in Leviticus. Who reads that far? We know about the Ten Commandments. We're simple people here. So then Rabbi Lapin, this is a conjecture, a hypothetical conversation. He said, "Oh, so the Ten Commandments. So remember the Sabbath, keep the Sabbath, keep it holy. What about that? Right? That's one of the Ten Commandments, and yet the Reform and the Conservative were driving to shul on Shabbos. So then if we're saying that the litmus test is the Ten Commandments, so then the whole bunch of you shouldn't come to the parade. But then there's going to be no parade, right? And I'm not saying the Jews for Jesus belong at the parade. I don't think we need a parade, right? And I'll tell you, that's one of the things I miss, emotionally as a kid, since I became an anti-Zionist. I miss that Salute to Israel parade was a fun experience, but I don't go to it. It's not for me. So these are the answers that I have. Meaning that it's hypocritical. And that this select, if people who are claiming to be liberal. I understand the Orthodox say they don't accept the Jews for Jesus, of course, and they're right. But I don't understand those who wear a banner of pluralism and inclusiveness and tolerance when they have the selective tolerance. And usually the ones that they don't tolerate are going to be the Orthodox. They're not going to tolerate the ultra-Orthodox. They're not going to tolerate the anti-Zionists, things like this. And then the anti-Zionists are going to answer, well, we don't recognize you either, right? So, but it is what it is. But that's my answer. Again, I'm not saying that everyone's going to agree with me, but I'm saying, personally, as a rabbi, this is how I understand it. That I don't believe that someone who denies basic Jewish precepts has the right to self-identify as a Jew. I, as a rabbi, or as a religious Jew, I can say, oh, this guy, according to halacha, unfortunately, perhaps is a Jew, or is a Jewish apostate. He's an apostate Jew. He has all the obligations of Jewishness, but none of the privileges. Meaning, he's obligated to come back and repent, but he doesn't. The only thing is kedusha of kedushin. That's in the halacha, that if a marriage bond is affected between two Jews and not affected between two Gentiles, between a Jew and a Gentile. It's affected between two Gentiles, but it's not kedushin. Gentiles have ishus and not kedushin. They have marriage, but it's not. But they don't have the sacramental marriage. In Judaism, the way I understand it is marriage is the sacrament par excellence, because the Sectus Kedushin is all about marriage. We call it, and it's not a sacrament in the Christian way, in the Catholic way, but it's the ultimate expression of holiness, because it's the bond between husband and wife is representative of the creative power of God. and yet, you could be Messiah Kedushin, you can be Messiah Chulin. You sign a marriage license, then you're Messiah Chulin. Well, thank you for watching. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe. Comment. And tell us what you think. And this is my approach. That this idea of a non-religious, someone who's anti-religious. I'm not talking about Reform and Conservative. I can understand Reform and Conservative Jews, even those who are not halachically Jewish. They have a right to self-identify as Jews based on their faith and their practice, however meager that faith and practice is. But Reform Judaism has faith and practice. As components of their community. They call themselves, constantly hearing them say Kehila Kadosha, or a sacred community. They recognize there's a sacred bond. In fact, the Reform will say that no, if you don't have any Jewish practices, even if your mother is Jewish, you're not part of their community. And there's authenticity in what they're saying there, meaning, someone who doesn't do anything at all for Yom Kippur. All right, it might not be so easy to get to synagogue for some people, depending where they live and this and that. And then there's a lot of people, maybe they don't, but like, let's say Yom Kippur means nothing. They're not a Jew, But Pesach means nothing. Not a Jew. These are the aspects. Now this is going to get to the next part of the video, but we've already gone on for a half hour, so I think at this point it's worthwhile to stop here, make a separate video to address the other aspect of the video. So thank you for listening. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe, comment, and we'll see you later. All right.